Pure competition eliminates those types of entrenched interest, and embracing a competitive marketplace would do far more than increasing government control to eliminate those concentrated powers. If you eliminate regulation, you are eliminating something that strangles enterprise, that raises costs, that limits entry into markets, that protects entrance interest. Learning economics helps you to think about the consequences that are on down the road.
Welcome to the Optimistic Curmudgeon, where the best ideas win. I'm your host, Josh Herring. This is a show all about ideas, about how we can rebuild a collapsing culture. My guests all have the credentials, the wisdom, the experience to say something meaningful, to contribute to the rebuilding of our moment. Season 9 is going to be our best season yet. Enjoy. I'm joined today by my friend Alan Mendenhall. Alan is a literary scholar and author of Southern fiction, a lawyer, a business professor, and now the senior advisor for the Capital Markets Initiative at the Heritage Foundation. A few weeks back, I just kind of woke up and did my normal morning news routine, and the Free Press in particular was very disturbed by the rise of Zohran Mamdani. And I, too, as I read more, was very disturbed. And I thought, you know what? Who would be a great person to chat with about this? Alan Mendenhall. I need a friend who will have good conversation, but also is very well versed in both business in a very practical sense and the good theory of economics that really underlies good practical business sense. So, Alan, I'm so excited that you were up for the conversation today.
Well, I'm really excited to be here. Thanks for having me on. I know I've been on here before. As I was telling you earlier, I think we should take credit for ending the Biden candidacy, since we did a post-debate analysis here, and I think that was the trigger.
It's possible you're right. That was my most live streamed ever event. I have an audience of anywhere from 10 to 50. That's a good range for the live stream part of the show. We broke 800 people watching our commentary that night. So I'm in there. There probably were a few big decision makers. Maybe does that mean Kamala is our fault? Like I'm perfectly happy to tank the Biden presidency. I don't know that I want to accept blame for Kamala Harris's candidacy
or credit for it. It was a hopeless campaign from the beginning.
That's it. Well, before we get into all the fun of socialism and just what's wrong with it, this morning I was reading Nellie Bowles' column on the Free Press. She does a satire column every Friday called TGIF. And she had a relevant bit in there today about New York City once again. Oh, I'm sorry. No, not New York City. We're in Minneapolis for this paragraph. So I'm just going to read this as a way of setting us up. And just in full transparency, the way that column works is it's always factually accurate, but it is satirical in tone. So I think they do a great job of hitting that tension point. So this paragraph is entitled, "No, you must eat your own dog food." The Minnesota Star Tribune is closing its local printing plant, cutting about 125 jobs from the Minnesota market and outsourcing to a facility in neighboring Iowa. The Star Tribune, a good progressive paper in good progressive Minneapolis, is fleeing progressive policies. See, Minnesota is a high-tax, pro-union state. Iowa is a low-tax, right-to-work state. My feelings: if you're a lefty newspaper advocating lefty policies, you cannot just escape them. Not allowed. If you want socialism, fine, cool. I did too when I was young and hot. But then make your socialist workers print the paper. You have your reporters take 25-minute breaks in between every paragraphs. Editors get paid $3 million. What? Like it'll be so hard? Why are you running from labor unions and taxes if you love labor unions and taxes so much, Minnesota Star Tribune? Come right back here and pay $1,000 an hour. And also pay the therapy bills of the one printer lady who shows up. All the others are on indefinite paid leave. I just thought that was a perfect way to kind of set up the tensions there. Thoughts, comments there before we move on to our regularly scheduled conversation?
Well, I guess, as I say all the time, if if you eliminate regulation, you are eliminating something that strangles enterprise, that raises costs, that limits entry into markets, that protects entrance interest. A lot of people get really angry about the what they call the political establishment or entrenched interest, embedded interest, all these kinds of things. But they embrace these policies that are high regulation, that involve government intervention. And what they don't understand is those are the very policies that create these entrenched interests, that pure competition eliminates those types of entrenched interest, and embracing a competitive marketplace would do far more than increasing government control to eliminate those concentrated powers.
No, I think that's exactly right. There's a temptation there to think that, oh, the government is able to establish far more freedom or far more, not even freedom, far more fairness for the worker, usually is what I see as being in view. The reality is that it just doesn't work. And that brings us to my first kind of big question. I want to get your, I've not done a ton of digging into this, just on the level of headlines and a couple of internet articles. But each time young people are surveyed, they seem to be more and more favorable towards socialism. And that's really the heart of Zohran Mamdani's campaign. I mean, he's not campaigning amongst the elderly per se. He's campaigning via TikTok videos and Instagram posts amongst the younger generations in New York City. So, Alan, I wanted to get your thoughts on why is socialism so popular, but then also why does it always fail?
Well, those are two kind of detailed. There's two big questions that involve detailed answers. So I'll try to tackle them first. I guess the reason why I think it's popular is that it has a message about helping the poor, and people want to help the poor. We have a sort of Western Christian ethos that obligates us to help the poor, and socialism purports to do that very thing. We have a pretty vast wealth gap between rich and poor, and people see that and think we are violating some fundamental fairness when there can be such a class distinction. So any theory that comes along that purports to resolve that will seem attractive. Unfortunately, economics does not bear that out. Economics shows that this is, in fact, the socialist program is, in fact, more destructive. So now you're getting into the question about why socialism doesn't work, and that requires a little more thinking. So people always jump to like the first solution, like, oh, what's the easiest thing to do? Like the counter to, for example, here in Alabama, a few years ago, we had some issues of child abuse in daycares, and everyone said we're gonna do all this stuff to crack down on daycare, and everybody thought that would be the obvious first thing to do. Well, people don't think on down. If you look, learning economics helps you to think about the consequences that are on down the road. So what happened is we cracked down on all these regulations of daycare, and then in particular in poor communities and poor African American communities, we erected these barriers to entry. And now you had these single moms who, in these communities, there aren't other businesses in these communities. There aren't a lot of, things to do for employment. So you had Black mothers that were staying home with kids and taking care of lots of kids. And now they have no jobs and they have no work because that the barriers to entry and the regulations have prevented those people from operating their own type of daycares. And the kids that were in a home with one of these mothers watching over them are now out on the streets, and they're starting to commit crimes and do this. So these are unintended consequences of regulation. That's just one example, but that's why socialism typically doesn't work. Is knowledge is dispersed throughout society. It's fragmented. Each of us has our own sort of individual motivations, and they differ from that of our neighbors down the street. They differ from the people that are in other communities that are farther away. They differ from people throughout the state, throughout the country. And that's why we have a price system, because the pricing system on a market gives us signals about the aggregate preferences of communities. And no one person or group of people, no central planner can know that information. That information is just available to us. That it arises by reflecting countless underlying realities in local communities. So there is a calculation problem. And if you have socialism, it tries to replace the pricing mechanism with centralized decision-making, and no centrally directed economy can be predicated on the actual aggregated knowledge of the community, which comes through natural pricing mechanisms, if that makes sense.
I think it does, and it's I did a fellowship with the Mercatus Center at George Mason several years ago, the Don Lavoie Fellowship, and as part of that, I read a bunch of books that were really far beyond my ability to comprehend economics. But it was a bit of a stretch. I'm a humanities guy through and through. I'm not a true blue economics or economical thinker. But we spent a lot of time in that fellowship on the very thing you're describing, the knowledge problem, and the way and there's this great temptation, I think, especially given the effectiveness of scientific measurement and then the application of scientific measurement to industrial processes in the early to mid 18th or 19th century. It seemed a logical extension to then say, well, we ought to be able to measure social economic interactions with the same level of precision, and we ought to be able to mechanically control for greater efficiency, and we ought to be able to get rid of some of these variations where you don't have, or maybe you don't have a Rockefeller, but you have everybody with a bit more prosperity. We ought to be able to do that, seemed to be the thought. The reality is that prices just don't work that way. Every time you try to kind of control that from central location, there's no way to gather together all the bits of data. I'm pretty sure the author is Leonard Reed wrote a modern adaptation of this in his essay, I Pencil. He talks about the just about 10,000 different pieces of data and operations that are all involved in creating a pencil that I can purchase a pack of 8 at the Dollar Tree for $1. I think it might be $2 now, given inflation.
Yeah, but if you had to make it yourself, how could you do it? It would take you a year, more than that, to put together a pencil, to get all the little pieces together, and it would be impossible.
Well, and that's not even thinking about the cost of the machinery involved and the skills that I need. I'm not very handy. So I really am starting over with I need to craft the wood in a certain way. I don't know how I would make an eraser, much less get the graphite, or go through some kind of trial and error process, learn, looks like this lead is poisoning me. I should change it to graphite.
Yeah. My eraser would be licking my finger and smearing the paper.
So yeah, that the knowledge problem, I think, is really crucial to understanding why socialism doesn't work. But I think you did a phenomenal job articulating the appeal. That poverty relief appeal hits in at least 2 different ways, right? I mean, it hits those who have middle to higher levels of income. They want to be involved in care for the poor in some meaningful way. But it also hits the poor with you mean there's an easy way out? The rich people can do this. This thing I currently have to scrape up money for could be free. There's an obvious appeal in that sense.
Yeah, that's true. And I want to say one more thing about the epistemic humility at the heart of sort of markets. And the reason I bring this up is when I was a doctoral student in English, I had a professor who was trying to kind of pick a fight. And I'm imperfectly recalling the accusation, but she said something to the effect of, people like you think you know everything. She was accusing me of arrogance. And I said, well, actually, what I think about markets is predicated on epistemic humility. It's based on my awareness of my own ignorance, because I would never purport to know what other people think or believe and what motivates them to act and why they respond to incentives in certain ways. I just don't know. And in fact, it's because I'm aware of how much I don't know that I would never seek to coerce them into a particular economic situation, that they don't agree with or that might in fact harm them. I would much rather leave it to the market, which allows price signals to show you the aggregate preferences as they emerge through spontaneous interaction and voluntary interaction. And in fact, I would never actually presume to have knowledge about why people who are very different from me or who, come from different backgrounds and have different beliefs, why they do what they do. So it's not in fact arrogance. It's the exact opposite of that. But at any rate, yeah, you're sorry, go ahead.
Well, on that point, I mean, you dropped the word. I want to draw attention to it. That term self-interest, I think, is a really important one for this conversation. I mean, because it was Adam Smith's observation that individuals act in their own economic self-interest. But that economic self-interest is not always apparent to other people. There are plenty of folks who could be in my field, particularly. I run an education department, but I'm very concerned with like what's happening in the field of K-12 education. There are plenty of people who could make more money in some other field, and yet they find different levels of value in shaping the hearts and minds and loves and hatreds of children, and doing that in a community of people who are working about this task. Now, if I'm sitting up top, looking down from my skyscraper, assuming that I know everyone's self-interest, I think you've raised a really important point that actually is there's an epistemic arrogance in that, whereas the recognition that each individual knows his own self-interest and acts in his own self-interest and has to determine what that is, I think that's far more a position of humility.
I think this part about self-interest is really key because it's what gets caricatured as a negative all the time. But there is no possible way for any human being to act otherwise than in his or her own self-interest, because we cannot be somebody else. But as Adam Smith points out in Theory of Moral Sentiments, it's projection onto others that is why it's in our self-interest to help others. When we see somebody in pain or somebody suffering, we imagine what it's like to be in that person's shoes. This is what we call sympathy or empathy. And it's because we imagine ourselves suffering that we find it in our own self-interest to help other people. So it's in our self-interest to help other people. Why? Because we know what it feels like to hurt. We know what it feels like to suffer, and we don't want other people to feel like that. And therefore, we help other people. So self-interest isn't just this purely egotistic, I'm going to just ravenously acquire everything for my own individual wants. Actually, our own individual wants involve other people. It's in my self-interest to make sure my children have a better life than I do. It's in my own self-interest to make sure that my church reaches as many people as possible and that it's sustainable and that it has enough money to operate. It's in my self-interest to make sure that my employer hires capable employees and that we do great things and that we help other people in the community. That's in my self-interest. It's in my self-interest to make sure that the city I live in is flourishing and prosperous and that we don't have homelessness and that we don't have crime. This is all part of my self-interest. And what does it require? It requires that I do things for other people. So that's why it is a terrible caricature to just fixate on this term self-interest and treat it as if it's purely egoism and purely selfishness.
Well, the other caricature I sometimes run into is the idea that self-interest can just be collapsed down to higher financial income, and that your self-interest is just monetary. And I think you just illustrated a whole bunch of qualities that are not strictly monetary. Like, they all use money to happen. If a town has no money, ultimately there's probably going to be a rise in crime because they can't pay their police force, and there's going to be a breakdown in other problems. To have a flourishing community, you do need to have kind of those sustainable systems of economic activity happening. I'm thinking of a recent change my wife and I made in our home finances, where she shifted over from full-time to far more flexible part-time work. And we had to rework our budgets to make sure, yep, okay, we can do that. But she is far happier as a human being. Just the way she is composed, she is so much better off working 10 to 20 hours a week. Now, on my end, I would feel pretty bored and kind of lost at sea if I wasn't like actively working somewhere between 40 and 60 hours a week. But it's not strictly monetary. It's the real question, I think, of self-interest is the same one that Socrates is asking. What is the good life and how do we live it? We all want to live that good life. And socialism, to take this back to our original bugbear, socialism holds out, I think, this false image, this idea that, oh, if we just control it from the top, we can divvy it all up in a way so that everyone has the right amount. Just the reality is that has failed every single time it's been tried.
Yeah, well, and I mean, if you think about it, socialism requires a body of people to rule over everybody else. There has to be somebody making decisions. And when it's not the people themselves, this is why I do struggle a lot with some of my libertarian friends who are opposed to populism, because I think, well, gosh, markets are kind of inherently populist because you're actually trying to vest control in consumers, in people, and that's sort of populist by nature. So anyway, there's a tension there. But when you look at different socialist and or communist regimes from the past, you realize that they have led to really, really terrible things. One of these books behind me is the Black Book of Communism. It's on one of these shelves.
Yep.
But I think it estimates somewhere like 100 million deaths worldwide due to socialism and communism. 100 million deaths. You know, we all know the figure 6 million, Jews were killed in the Holocaust. Horrible, awful. Why do we also not recognize that 100 million deaths were caused by socialism and communism? You know, we've got people calling people a Nazi in our political discourse as a way to discredit them. And it's not even an accurate label, but we actually have people literally embracing a system that killed 100 million people worldwide, and it's okay. Like people are okay with this. That is what is so shocking. And people will say, "Oh, well, the Nordic countries, those are socialist." Oh my goodness! Have you looked at the World Economic Freedom Indices? Whether it's Fraser, whether it's Heritage, the people that do this, those Nordic countries rank a lot higher than the United States of America on the economic freedom indices. They're more open to trade and exchange. They have fewer barriers to entry. They have less regulation. They're much more business friendly, and they're also as a community, for those very reasons, they have a lot less poverty than we do. So even if they do have social safety net in their government, they don't have many people reliant on it. So these countries are just also much more kind of culturally homogenous. And there's something to be said for that, because in that kind of cultural homogeneity, you build up certain levels of trust. You build up the ability to exchange with people who are similar to you and who hold like values. And that creates that creates a fluid system where people are more willing to do business because of the trust, because they know what this people are going to do and what they're like. And that's also a very important thing.
Oh, it really is. A couple things you mentioned. Those are some great thoughts. I think you're absolutely right about the way a socialistic approach centralizes power in a small group, and the difference between the appearance and the reality, I think, is really crucial here, because typically a socialist popularizer, I'm just going to keep referencing Mamdani as doing this, and the sense is like, this is a power to the people. This is helping the people. It's all about the people. But the reality is that there's going to be that small group that makes decisions. C.S. Lewis talks about this in his book, The Abolition of Man. He particularly talks about the idea of if the controllers, where I'm thinking of it in there, where he talks about if you were to dissolve traditional ethics and to abandon the traditional systems of Western ethical formation, what you would get instead are small groups of men at the top of civilization who are going to make decisions, but they've cut themselves off from the very sources of wisdom that could have shaped those decisions. And so instead, you get these controllers who no longer have some legacy or heritage that they are trying to emulate or surpass. They now only have making society in their own image. And I think if you go over to the Soviet Union, you actually, during the height of the USSR, Alexander Solzhenitsyn is just brilliant at describing this in the Gulag Archipelago. But he shows this is exactly what the Communist Party in its control in the Soviet Union was trying to do. But then he also takes you into the heart of corruption in the midst of communism, because it's one thing, and this too is something I think socialists, communists, progressives, the political left, they sort of are, their parties are usually made up of terrible human beings with horrible records on like ethical actions in their personal lives. But in speech, they always presume that there will be perfectly rational, good people who are going to make these decisions. The reality is that you get at the top of this kind of system, you get deeply corrupt human beings. I'll just name drop the city of San Francisco, and we already mentioned Kamala Harris. I mean, Kamala Harris is one of these political machine appointees who is deeply corrupt in a provable way that plenty of people talked about during her candidacy. So I won't rehearse that. But I think socialism lends itself to this kind of centralizing power at the top and then wielding that power within a party structure that is prone to corruption internally. So it's even in a utopian scenario that will never exist, if we could get the perfect blueprint of distributing economic wealth across New York City, that perfect distribution might last an hour before somebody needs a favor. And there's gone. Last thing I want to say on that, but I'll turn it back over to you. Several years ago, we never actually ended up using this, but I got on a debate strategy where I wanted to have my debaters be ready to explain that government is not always the answer. And we found another source of that same number that you were citing to the Black Book of Communism. R.J. Rummel, I think he's at UT Austin, or at least he was at the time. He published this fascinating book called Death by Government. And it is a study of all the ways that Western governments have killed their people across the 20th century. And I mean, and you read it and you're like, I mean, now the United States is not as bad as most of the other governments there, but like, every government is involved in contributing to hundreds of millions of people dying. He does also move eastward, and he also looks at Mao's Great Famine, which was one of my favorite examples of where you get a Mao called for he set a 5-year plan where China would outproduce the West in steel production. And to get there, it required all the men of a generation to leave the rice paddies and go work in steel production. But if no one is growing rice, eventually you have a famine. So there's literally 50 million Chinese men and women who died because of a governmentally man-made caused famine, which is just, it's mind-blowing to think that we actually have, I'll also name drop Bernie Sanders here because he affiliates with the Democratic Socialist of America, that we have folks in America kind of making this argument. And I don't want to, just a couple of days after Charlie Kirk's assassination, I don't want to at all say they don't have the right to say such things. It just boggles my mind that that anyone takes them seriously. It ought to be so obvious that this fails.
Yeah, I think that's right. And you're right to point out the numbers. Under Mao, you've got 50, 60 million people dead from famine, from killing, from murder. The Soviet Union, you've got over 20 million dead from the gulags and famine and Stalin's purges. And you got Cambodia, Vietnam, North Korea, Eastern Europe. They got all these different places where you have a death count, you have human bodies, and it should be disturbing that people advocate for a system that results in those kinds of things. And again, you have politicians like Bernie Sanders who will point to the Nordic countries as an example, but Like I said, go to these Fraser Institute, go to the Heritage World Economic Freedom Indices, and look at where those Nordic countries rank versus the United States, and you'll see they actually enjoy much more economic freedom than we do, and that technically, by those criteria, we're actually more socialist than Norway, Sweden, Denmark, all those places. So anyway,
Well,
I would encourage people to go.
One other difference to those Nordic countries that it always comes to my mind when I hear that comparison is just the size. The United States is, I believe, the third largest country by land mass in the world. We are behind Russia and we are behind China in land mass. But we are by no means culturally homogenous. I agree with you. I think that actually makes a really big difference when we're thinking about building a high trust society where we actually could have governmental promises that are made and then kept. We have our system of government is made up. Our federal government is supposed to be at the top of 50 primarily active state governments. Now we've mostly inverted that in the last 100 years, where we have a far more active federal government and state governments that are usually happy to let the federal government take on some of their responsibilities and fiscal costs and so on.
Yeah, over 30% of Alabama's revenue comes from the federal government. So that shows you even in a red state, we're dependent on federal largesse, which is terrible. But you're right, the system of federalism would be great economically because you could do some experimentation on the state level that wouldn't affect the entire country if there are failures. And I think gradually, that's the type of innovation and experimentation that we want to see. We want to see progress develop out of decentralized bottom-up adaptation rather than top-down coercion or command.
Which I think we're watching that sort of experiment happen sort of in real time with the examples of California and Florida as extremes on both ends, and with maybe New York and Illinois as less extreme blue examples, and Texas and maybe Tennessee as less extreme red state examples. But you've got blue states that are inclined towards socialistic policies. None of them are fully socialist in the sense of controlling the means of production or nationalizing a government per se, or nationalizing a company per se. But California is the worst state in the country for having nanny state policies. I was hanging out with parents of a friend of mine last week, and they were telling me about a property they are attempting to renovate and sell just outside Los Angeles. And it has been a 7-year struggle to get permits. Not to find contractors, not to have shoddy work redone, not to find buyers, just to get the permitting done so that the work can occur. I mean, and in contrast, and California has lost, I believe we're up to 5 congressional seats California has lost for the next year.
And we're 5 consecutive years in a row now of more people leaving California than coming in. 5 consecutive years.
But people are voting with their feet. I mean, this is... and I'm in North Carolina, and I thought this would subside after COVID, but I keep meeting people who have moved here from California, also from New York. They really like us here in North Carolina for some reason.
Even Alabama, we're picking up population, and you get nervous that people move here and they bring their politics with them, and they think, well, don't do to us what you just did to that state.
Right. Well, let's go back to New York. I want to pitch you some specific policies that Mamdani is running on. So just for the clarity for our audience, I am not making this up. These are the actual policies that Zohran Mamdani has said he will work to implement if he is made mayor, and that he has tried to already implement in his position as an alderman. I'm thinking particularly of rent freezes, city-owned and operated grocery stores. And free buses are the ones in particular. Though, if you know anything more about it than I do, there's also something from last week about possibly getting rid of a gang registration database. They're currently trying to track gang members, and Mamdani's like, why? Why would we do that? Like, Alan, what would happen to? I mean, I think this matters in particular because New York City is just iconic. In American history, American literature, but primarily in the American economy. This is where Wall Street is. This is the center of American big business. and particularly big established businesses that are in many cases are 100, 200, 300 years old. So what happens to New York City if these policies go into effect?
Well, you're right about New York as a symbol. There was a reason why the World Trade Center was the target of 9/11. But if you look at, take big picture economic principles. If prices are signals that coordinate supply and demand, as we kind of spoke about earlier, if government is going to impose controls on those prices, then the signals are all going to be falsified. So you're going to get things like chronic shortages where prices are going to be held below market rates, or maybe even surpluses if the prices are held above market rates. You're going to get black markets developing where you have people buying and selling things illegally against the price controls. And this is going to always benefit those political establishment people, the people that are part of that centralized control. They're going to be able to get things cheaper than what the ordinary people who lack political connections will be able to get them for. With rent freezes, if you keep rent, this is just basic stuff. If you keep rent at an artificially low rate, a landlord can't have enough money to keep up with the property, to maintain stuff, to do new construction, all these kinds of things. So what does that mean? It means you're not only you're going to get, slums and like worse living conditions, but you're going to have a lower housing supply, a shrinking housing supply, and all the housing crisis that you were trying to solve is actually going to get a lot worse. And so that's one, it's counterproductive. If you're talking about groceries, you're going to have fewer groceries. It's just these are this kind of basic things. People complain. This is a little bit outside the scope, but I hear whenever, because I'm in Alabama, we get tornadoes as a result of the hurricanes. We do have hurricanes that hit our coast down south, but when that happens, sometimes we have an issue with what we call price gouging. And everyone says, well, we need to make sure there are all these laws to prevent the people from hiking up gas prices to take advantage of this weather situation. And again, the natural sort of like short-term thinking is that that's a great idea. We don't want to hurt people.
Right.
But the economic explanation shows why that's bad. Okay, well, if the gas stations aren't able to raise those prices to reflect market conditions, the sudden demand for gas, and we force those businesses to keep gas at artificially low rates, well, guess what? Everybody's going to run to the gas station, fill up their pumps, and there's going to be no gas. And then, it's people like me. I do it all the time. I'm like, oh my gosh, there's a tornado. I've got 80% full. I'm going to go fill up this 20% just in case something bad happens. And everybody like me is doing the same thing. And then all of a sudden you can't go, you go to the gas station and they've got little yellow bags over all the pumps because there's no gas. The gas is gone. And so now the people that really, really needed the gas don't have it. It's gone. There's scarcity. And that is an avoidable problem where technically if you had let the people hike the prices, then only the people who really needed to get gas would be getting it. And actually the price wouldn't have been so high. It would have been what the natural market conditions are because, there wouldn't have been a run on gas, basically. So these are just basic things that like people operate initially on like their first gut reaction and without considering economics has a sort of 5 steps later explanation for why things are done the way they're done, and why these can result in negative effects that just aren't foreseeable from like the impulse reaction.
I think it's so fascinating what you're describing, Alan, is the clarity with which I think you're illustrating the fact that we do know what these principles are. I mean, this is not a mystery. I mean, there's certainly maybe a mystery in like what exactly will happen if the Federal Reserve like moves the basal rate by 0.25%, 0.5%, maybe a whole percent up or down. that might be a little mysterious. You're talking about the absolute basics of supply and demand, of looking at the nature of prices, and the fact that all economic actors are acting in relation to their self-interest. So if I'm running, I'm thinking of there's a kind of a seedy, cheap gas station that was across from the street from the apartment my wife and I used to live in. And whoever owns that gas station is making a pretty penny. And it stays open 24/7. But if he's not able to make a profit, he's either just going to sell it or close it down if he can afford to just like cut his loss and run. On your housing example, I'm thinking of a couple of friends I know who own a property together. It's a townhouse. They had an absolutely horrific tenant. I mean, like Alan, this guy wouldn't pay his bills, and the city cut the water off. So when they went in to like renovate, they found buckets of urine like in this townhouse. It was awful. And but this was a townhome that was I think they were charging $1,500 a month for rent, which was normal for their market, and that size townhouse. But their renovation cost about $25,000 if everything goes through on budget. So I didn't do the math before the show, and I'm not good with mental math, but it takes a lot of years to make back $25,000 at $1,500 a month as at your rent. I mean, so in order for them to be able to offer a place for someone to live without becoming a property owner, these owners have to turn a profit. And if they can't, they will do the same thing. They'll cut their losses, even if they have to take a hit, and they'll get out, and they'll just to keep the property value from sinking or their own assets from sinking.
Well, I'm glad you're bringing this up, because the most shocking thing to me about being in a business school was that there were students who believed that profits as a concept are bad, that profits are bad. And in a business school, but I had to, you have to explain. I mean, profits are just math. It is literally, net revenue minus expenses. And it's just a matter of accounting. That's what profits are. Without profits, no business can employ anybody.
Yeah.
No business can participate in any charity or philanthropy. Without profits, there is really no way to help the poor at all.
Yeah. It's the profits that generate growth and expansion and the creation of new positions that then enable. It's profits that enable investment in new ideas, or that enable risk to happen. You're not really risky if you're only breaking even. You're willing to take a risk if you've built enough of a stable foundation that you could lose this money and still be okay. But you've got to have profited enough for that to work.
Yeah.
Now, Alan, I know we're coming up on our time here in a moment, so I want to ask you to think. You gave us, I think, a really clear picture of like what would happen if these policies. I did want to mention Matt Walsh had a fascinating bit on his show a couple weeks ago where he talked about a city somewhere in the Midwest that did free buses, and he talked about those buses turning into rolling homeless shelters. And I think New York City already has a homelessness problem. And so if their buses turned into that, I think that would be pretty terrible. But
the phrase that there's no such thing as a free lunch. I mean, there's no such thing as a free bus. If somebody's paying the cost, it's just the taxpayers. So, you're gonna if you have a bunch of people who don't have to pay the cost because they aren't taxpayers because they don't have money, well, then that's gonna inflate demand, so it's going to be artificially high, and a lot of people who maybe are homeless are going to be using those buses. Then you're going to have overuse, you're going to have misallocation of resources, you're going to have declining quality, you're going to have all these things, and that's just that's just a way to take away from the other industries that could be employing these very people that are homeless. They could be driving Uber, they could be driving taxis, they could be doing there are all these other jobs that now get crushed by this policy. So you're actually taking away the opportunity for people to work, which is where we find so much of our dignity in the work we do.
Well, as we wrap up today, I want to think about what New York City could be in kind of a different avenue of the future. I mean, if I'm very hopeful that the Republican Party in New York City will get their act together and run a viable candidate against Mamdani. So far, that clearly viable candidate has not emerged. But if you had a mayor of New York who was economically savvy, I want to ask you this: like, what would you imagine New York City looking like if the government fully embraced rule of law, minimal regulation, and a positive atmosphere towards building wealth? What would that New York City look like?
We talked about. Sorry, I froze there for a minute. Am I good?
Yep, you're good. I was like,
yeah,
man, I didn't think it
okay.
was that terrible of a question, but maybe it was.
I froze. No, I froze there for a second.
Yep, you're good.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you brought that up, because when we were talking about the Nordic countries earlier, here's an area where we could mimic them, where they are far less socialist, so to speak, than we are, not in the sense of controlling the means of production, but just in the sense of regulation, which is they don't have so many barriers to entry when it comes to different areas to work. So without those regulations, you'll see a growth in entrepreneurship, new businesses, new startups, new innovations. What we tend to see here at both the state and federal level is entrenched interests lobbying government to erect all these barriers to entry, all these anti-competitive measures, so that you don't have new entrants into the market, so that it's harder for there to be competition. And what does that mean? It means the controlling interests can hike prices to artificially high levels, and they don't have to compete. Well, competition is really about driving prices down so that you get more consumers and improving the quality of your product so you get more consumers. Well, if you don't have competition, then the quality goes down and the prices go up. It's a pretty simple thing, but you would have lower costs, I think, if you had less government intervention, a more deregulated New York. You could have improved finance and labor markets. They'd be freer. You'd have more workers and less state control. This is, again, just basic economics. And ironically, given Bernie Sanders' professed support for Nordic countries, these Nordic countries have figured a lot of these things out. I think the big thing, this is a big thing from a cultural level, is you get less corruption, less cronyism. The bigger government gets, the more you have this intertwined business and government corporatism. And that's what I think a lot of people that just jump to socialism as a kind of knee-jerk reaction don't understand. They don't like the big business. They don't like the big corporations. Well, guess what? The big business and the big corporation, they love bigger government. They love it. They want to prevent small businesses from competing with them. The bigger government is, the more they can observe regulatory compliance costs, the more they dominate the market, and they don't have to worry about these upstart crows, so to speak. So yeah, I think if people understood that, especially young people, they might start thinking differently. Oh, socialism leads to corruption, cronyism, etc.
I think that's really helpful, and we won't go here today, because we could do a whole different conversation about that comment you made about big business and big government. I think that's really interesting, in part because I've talked to friends who own small businesses that they've started, and when Trump's tariff laws went into effect, for example, they had, these particular friends had ordered a machining part that could only come from Shanghai, and it cost $100,000. While it was en route to the United States, the tariff went into effect, and suddenly it cost $200,000. Now, $100,000 for a small business is a massive, big deal in terms of cost. If Walmart has to absorb an extra $100,000 in costs, like they can kind of shrug that off. They're big enough. And so I think there's something really interesting about the way that the size of those of government and business kind of relates to each other, both of which are really opposed to small businesses getting started and actually being players in that space. But that's a conversation for another day. Alan, this has been absolutely delightful. I really appreciate you coming on the show. I do want, before we say farewell, I do want to mention we did not talk at all about Venezuela or Cuba. Those are perhaps the closest to the United States examples of socialist experiments. Cuba has been going on since the 1950s, I believe, and it's been awful. Venezuela is more recent, where they literally just kind of took a thriving oil and gold-based economy and have cratered it in a way that has sent thousands of refugees to other countries and has led to immense hardship under the rule of socialist dictator Maduro. So there's another close to home and close in time example. Any quick thoughts on those two before we?
Well, I'll just say this. How much illegal immigration from the United States to Cuba is there? How much illegal immigration from the United States to Venezuela is there? It's not happening. It's in the reverse, and there's a reason.
That's right. Alan, where can people find and follow your work online if they want to keep up with what you're doing?
I guess the easiest place is my website, which is just www.alanmendenhall.com. And I spell my first name Allen. And of course, you could just go to Google, go to Amazon. It's out there.
Excellent. And what's next in your writing pipeline? I know you've always got stuff going.
Oh, well, I write a weekly column for a conservative paper here in Alabama called 1819 News. It's bold, it's ambitious, it's awesome. I write 2 pieces a month for the Freeman. The Foundation for Economic Education has revived the Freeman as a Substack, so I write 2 pieces a month for them, and I'm always publishing something or other. I don't have a current book project besides collecting some of my personal kind of columns, and maybe I'll publish an edition that includes those. But I need to. I've got a novel in mind. I need to get that down on paper.
Oh, that's exciting news. Well, Alan, thank you so much for coming on the show today. This has been wonderful.
Thank you. Thanks very much for having me.
Well, thank you, listeners and viewers, for joining us here on The Optimistic Curmudgeon. I'm your host, Josh Herring, and I want to thank especially our live stream audience for joining us today. I put this out on socials about 10 minutes before we started, and we've had a pretty consistent audience the whole time. If you're new to the show, please do like, follow, subscribe on whichever platform you're on, or make your way over to YouTube, search for The Optimistic Curmudgeon. That's where this interview will ultimately live after we kind of do a little bit of editing and put it together in its final form. It'll be there here in a few weeks. You've been listening to another episode of The Optimistic Curmudgeon. If you enjoyed this episode, like it and share it with your network. Help others think great ideas. You can find the show on all the platforms, but primarily on X as @TheOptimisticC3, on Facebook and LinkedIn under my name, Josh Herring, and on YouTube and Apple Podcasts. Be sure to subscribe to get the next conversation.